Hey everyone, I'm just here with my personal town planner, Liam, who works for a company called DTS in Brisbane. Probably the best town planner in Brisbane. I've used a lot, so I know the good, bad, and the ugly. So there's only a couple of town planners I use, and Liam is doing at least 8 to 10 of my applications for me at the moment in the development space. So welcome on, Liam, and thanks so much for jumping in the call today.
Thanks, Adam.
So we are going to talk about a few different things to do with town planning. Liam's got a couple of examples on some subdivision sites, just 1 into 2 lots, just some smaller ones to give you guys an idea on what you can get approved and what challenges Liam had to overcome to get the approval. So when you're looking at a site to split into 2 or 3 or however many lots, you can look at it with different set of eyes, knowing some planning principles that you can tweak and make a site work that other people have overlooked. So Liam spent, just to put Liam up on a pedestal, tell everyone how good you are. And the reason why I'm using you for a lot of my applications is 15 years as a town planner. He's very astute, diverse range of types of applications and dealings, mostly with Southeast Queensland councils. And having used multiple town planners and gone through different types of applications, I know now, what makes a good planner and what doesn't. And a lot of it does come down to the angle, the pitch to council, and also overcoming obstacles and how to overcome them and engaging those different consultants. So I'll hand it over to you, Liam. Just give us a really brief overview. What does a town planner do, and when does somebody engage or need to engage a town planner with their property?
Thanks, Adam. So the best way to explain what a town planner does is it's our job to kind of navigate a client through the process from site acquisition to development approval. So, like our role is really trying to get through all of the guff to make things simple. And there's a lot of moving parts with property development, and our job is more so like a project manager or having a really good overview of the whole part of an application or that process in terms of coordinating with other consultants and having a good understanding about what other issues outside of town planning will come up in a project, whether it's bushfire, ecology, or servicing. So that's really what a town planner does. In terms of when you start speaking to me or a town planner,
Yeah.
that can be as early or as late as you like, and it does depend on what kind of project you're looking to do and what kind of risk you're willing to take. So, for example,
Early though. I'll
yeah,
touch on that a bit
preferably
later.
early. Correct. So we've had some clients, for example, where they've come to us and said, we are looking to do this type of project. What properties should I look for? What things do I need to know when I'm looking at these kind of projects? Pretty simplistic. If you say, I want to do 1 into 2s, what zones, what's the lot sizes, what's the lot frontages. We can
Yep.
give clients upfront information so they can go and look at the correct sites rather than kind of
Yeah.
spending all
That
their
is
time scattergunning
Yeah, that is my
the wrong
suggestion,
ones.
by the
Yeah,
way. But also my suggestion is do my course, find out how to do a feasibility, because there's no point in saying to Liam, oh, what sites do I need to buy to do a 1 into 2 or 1 into 3? And then you go out and you just waste time looking at sites that people want too much money for or in areas that don't work. So there's a two parts to that. There's one is the financial
that's
modeling, and
correct.
there's the other one, which is what can I actually do and where do I look for this financial model.
Correct.
So I start just on that. I start off, and my strategy and what I teach in my course is to start with the financial model and then put the pieces into that model. Because if you can't make money out of it, don't even bother with all these other things. Don't waste Liam's time if the financial model doesn't work. I'll hand back over to you, Liam.
Yeah, and that's right. So like we don't give financial advice
Neither do I.
and we don't give project feasibility advice. Like we definitely give advice on the cost expectations of the process, and obviously you can get advice from engineers and that kind of thing to feed into your FISO. But you are right in terms of like our job is to give you or give the developer advice to assist in what their strategy is. So if the strategy is you're making a certain percentage on this kind of development, it works in this area, then we can obviously spit in the additional information to get the ball rolling. I suppose when you start looking at specific sites, you're better off speaking with a town planner earlier. And the reason is, and most town planners, including myself, we want to help a client with a site at that really early stage, because if the client doesn't pick the site up, then I don't get a job. So one of the things we're looking to do in that early stage is to give assistance to a client to understand the fundamentals of a site straight away. So, for example, if they know that a 1 into 2 or a 1 into 3 is going to stack up on the site, the first thing they want to know is, can you get 3 lots? Can you get 2 lots? And then you work through a series of a hierarchy of problems, or hierarchy of criteria, to a point where the project is, or the site's feasible to push ahead. That advice can be quite quick, it can be quite simple, but definitely recommend speaking to someone earlier rather than at a later stage, once you've bought the property and you find out that it's got all these hairs on it.
Yeah, preferably not after you've bought the property, but I know there's plenty of people that do it because they don't know, they don't think about it. Even just a buy and hold property, even if it's your family home, because at some point in the future, it may not be your family home. You might get relocated for work. You might want to upgrade, downgrade, or downsize, whatever it is. So, you know, even if you're thinking, oh, well, I don't need to look at town planning for this property because I'm just going to hold it and I'm not going to develop it. I think it's worthwhile at least knowing what the planning is for that site. And also it might get rezoned. Like, it could literally be the difference between your house being worth an extra $100,000 in the future or being worth an extra $1 million. If that site gets rezoned or it's got development potential, I'd want to know, if I'm going to drop 500,000 or $1 million or whatever on a house, I'd want to know, well, what is the development potential? And ideally, me thinking out loud is, I'd want to know, well, is this development potential even good? Like, does it even add any value to this property? If it doesn't, then it's just a straight buy and hold. But if there's potential for future, because not every property, just because it's a development site, doesn't mean that it's worth more money. So
correct.
I think everyone should actually get a town planner to look at their property before they buy it. I actually think it should be mandatory, personally, because there's so many different things that people don't know about. Like, you buy a property that might be an acreage and you don't realize the whole area has been rezoned, and that might be great for your value, but you might have planned to be there for 20 years. So you might end up having a townhouse development next door to you and all this construction, or you're in the middle of it. Or you might find that there's a high rise going next to you and you didn't know about it, and now it's got overshadowing, or whatever the implications are, good or bad.
Yeah, and like, one of the big things as well, that like most of our clients, that they can use like an interactive mapping system and work out a zoning. It's really, like, a really good example is a draft planning scheme instrument, which you kind of have to dig through a council website to check. So they're like in the opposite situation, Adam, where instead of getting an upzoning, you can get a downzoning. So you want to be aware and there's really good examples of that through Camp Hill, where properties went from low medium density back to character. So that happened years ago now, but similar thing, there was people who just lost a lot of development rights on their properties. So that's another thing. And there's all those little, and you're right, like all those little checks, even if you're proposing to hold your property, if the fundamentals were you're trying to check fundamentals. Does it have sewer? Is there a flooding issue? Is there anything going to pop up, or is there anything preventing you from looking at developing in the future? And
is there a protected tree on the site?
Correct. Is there a street tree?
If you want to remove the tree, even if it's your house, you probably should know that up front. You'd want to know that up front.
Correct. Yeah. Tree retention can be, and on smaller sites, 1 into 2s, if there's a big tree and it's in the road, it can be very problematic, and it can be high risk in terms of, if you have to keep the tree, what does that do to the development outcome? So all those things are really, and once again, a town planner will pick that up quickly for you, so you can just understand yes, you're going into a property with an upside, not a downside.
Absolutely. But keep in mind, guys, town planners aren't running the feasibility numbers for you. And in my experience, I mean, you can get a valuer to run those numbers, or you can get a project manager. But in my experience, you are ultimately responsible for that. And you're also responsible for running the feasibility. So if you buy a site and you're like, sweet, this is going to be a development site in the future, and 5 years rolls around and it's not a development site, or it is, and developers end up offering you less, then that's on you. Because you don't know the numbers, you don't understand it. And unfortunately, most people don't. It's not actually that hard. It's like anything, it's just having the knowledge. And just to run a basic feasibility, you don't need to know a lot. You just really need to know the inputs and how to find the inputs. And that
Correct. Yeah.
part of it's not, in my view, it's not that hard. Once you know, if somebody says talk to a town planner, okay, now let's talk to a builder, let's talk to this person, civil contractor, let's talk to an engineer. Like, they're the pieces you need to know to be able to work it out. But anyway, let's jump to the examples. So Liam's got a couple of examples we're going to run through on sites. So they're 1 into 2 lot subdivisions where Liam DTS has been able to overcome some adversities to get an outcome that otherwise wouldn't have been gotten. So I have basically taken a block of land that people thought you couldn't subdivide, and it's been able to be subdivided. So Liam, if you just want to hit your share screen. And
Sure. So with the smaller sites and the 1 into 2s, the risk mitigation should occur prior to the acquisition of the property. So
yeah,
they're generally
just zoom in a little bit so we can see.
Sure. So generally speaking, the smaller subdivision, there's less complexities that you're going to run into. Like, you're not building new road, you're not dealing with a stormwater basin or something like that. So the risk for the project is simplified. There's still a risk, and obviously it's our job to navigate those risks for you. So this is a good example of us working with the client to mitigate the risk prior to the acquisition of the property. So if you're looking at this property, the high point is at the bottom of the screen, and it obviously slopes toward the road, so it slopes up the page. So this site was mapped as an overland flow path, which is basically a sheet flow flooding event when there's a really heavy rainstorm, so a 1 in 50 rain event.
So in simple terms, it rains, a lot of water goes across the site, and it goes out to the street. So from the bottom of the page to the top of the page, that's where the water runs when it rains.
Yeah, exactly. So straight away, the recommendation to this client was to go and speak with a flood engineer to actually run a model so they can understand what the impacts are. And anytime we see overland flow, the automatic recommendation is going to go and speak to a flood engineer, given that council's mapping doesn't always reflect what the flow path is, and it can be bigger or it can be smaller.
Yeah. So just for context on that, for those people that haven't looked at these types of sites, so you've got different mapping layers and different constraints on sites, and council has put those constraints because you've got to deal with them. So if you want to subdivide your land and you want to put 2 dwellings on it instead of 1, you've got to justify to council why they should allow you to put 2 new dwellings, so have more people living on this property versus the previous one. Because if council approve it and the houses flood, well, then council's going to get sued because they approved a house to be developed over a floodplain ultimately. So
so obviously council's wanting to ensure that there's no flood risk to those properties. So there's some earthworks involved in this property to achieve minimum ground levels. But what council is interested in, it's an existing flow path, and they're wanting us to demonstrate that where the flow comes onto the property, so it's flowing onto the property from the bottom. And in this case, you can see in that light blue easement, which is EMT, we were able to provide basically a concrete swale drain, so just a V drain, to pick up any water and directed around the property out to the street. So during that flood event, no water is going to come onto the site and into the houses. But also, and obviously this is part of a flood engineer's job, our development doesn't block the flow path and cause an upstream nuisance. So we're not blocking it and then the neighbour upstream gets flooded. So that's part of the demonstration of the earthworks and the V-drain, ensuring those flows can actually get out to the street and we're not blocking it.
Yeah.
So this is a good example of mitigating that risk before having to go unconditional. Flooding's a pretty risky thing, and if you don't have it locked down, as soon as that flood model's done, if it's an adverse impact and you're in a situation where you may not get an approval from council. And you flood it, and your
You
flood
don't want to be
engineer will
buying a
say,
flood affected site without a solution, basically.
correct.
And
you
want to know how expensive is this solution. So in this instance, it's not so bad having a drain in that blue section. That might have been maybe a $20,000 or $30,000 drain potentially, depending on how big it was. So you've just got to allow for those costs. So if it's going to cost me 20 grand, but I can put 2 houses on this property instead of 1, is that going to be worth it for me? And it probably was, obviously. And Liam, you mentioned about unconditional. So when doing a development site, it's very rare that developers or a property to subdivide. Like, I'm not going to go in and buy a property at an auction and then try and work out whether I can subdivide it or not. I'm going to want to put my foot on the site, so put it under contract and what's called a conditional contract. So it's conditional on some item, whatever I say that is. So it's conditional on me working out whether or not I can subdivide this property. And that might be for a period of 3 weeks, 4 weeks on a site this big. And then during that time, that's when you get the flood model done. Well, that's when you talk to the town planner because they're the first point of call. And then the town planner, Liam, says, okay, well, it's got overland flow issues. So we need to get a flood engineer and he needs to tell us what we need to do to overcome the flooding. And what does that look like? And this is a good outcome, but it could have been a lot worse than this. And it normally
is. So like with, obviously, probably Adam, you've got a lot more experience, but with these small sites, generally speaking, the acquisition, the seller might not want to offer you due diligence. So a lot of the time, our job is reflective of what risks we can mitigate in the timeframes you're working to. So for example, on this property, if the client said, well, I'm not going to get due diligence timeframes, our advice would have been, well, the best case scenario is this. The worst case scenario is you've bought a house or block that you can't subdivide, and they need to be comfortable going forward on the basis that they've bought it as a single house block. Now, in this case, I do believe that this property that would have been okay if they couldn't subdivide, because they wouldn't have lost any money if they had to put it back on the market. A lot of the time as well, with sites that flood, that scares people away. So you can get a bit of wiggle room with a seller in terms of getting a DD period to run a flood model to double check it.
DD meaning due diligence.
Correct. Sorry, due diligence. So yeah, like it's just about trying to mitigate the risk, and flooding's one of the bigger risks you see with the smaller sites. This site here, you can see there's some sewer, stormwater pipes and a stormwater manhole. So that's that area in the light green. Once again, like when you've got pipes and manholes in your property, it's really important that you pick those up via survey. So our company also does surveying, and obviously what you're trying to do, and if you can imagine here, you can see a manhole on the right hand lot, so just under
that
where
circle,
it says 32. So just
the
circle
the
there.
SW stands for stormwater, just in case you're wondering. So with the mouses,
so obviously at the time that manhole was buried, and that's pretty common. Like a lot of these manholes in people's private properties, over 30, 40 years, there's dirt goes on.
A manhole, just to further explain that, is just a circular pit, and it's a junction point. So
correct.
There's 2 pipes heading into one pit, and then it goes off into one pipe.
Yeah, that's right. So you can see in this case, you've got the two pipes from the upstream catchment going into one pipe.
Yeah.
Now, in this case, that pit was buried. So a lot of the time, surveyors, if they can't find it, they'll plot it from records. So when that happens, you've just got to be very cautious around whether the records are going to match what's on the ground, because sometimes they don't. Now, this was an example where the records were slightly off from what was actually delivered. So if you can imagine where that manhole is, obviously you can't build a house over it. So that manhole was on that right-hand side, so they can manage that through a dwelling design. When it was exposed, it moved a little bit further into the site. So you can imagine that's a bit of a headache to when you've got to narrow the building to get around the manhole. So that was one of the things, I suppose, that for this project was a bit of a pitfall, was that the manhole wasn't exposed until it was kind of too late. That
Yeah.
once
So
it finally was
in other
exposed.
words, in summary, they thought there was a manhole
Yeah,
in the location shown on this plan. It turned out to be that it wasn't. It was further into the middle of the block. And subsequently, the developer who bought this site, they built a house on there. They had to build the house around the manhole. And
yeah.
Liam,
So
you told me yesterday they built a little courtyard in the middle, which worked out.
that's right. Yeah. So it actually
Okay.
looked pretty. It actually looked pretty cool with a central courtyard, and they had bedrooms on either side, kind of facing it, which was quite a nice design feature. Unusual, of course, but it
Yeah.
dealt with the
But
problem, and they came up with
it
a
just costs
solution.
more money. That's the
Correct.
only. So
Correct.
the pitfall is it costs more money, and are you going to be able to get that money back on the end? And they probably would have, because it was a unique, nice design. So it might have cost them an extra 10 grand, but it is a bit of an annoyance to have to alter the design around that. And you've also got the stormwater pipes as well, because they're easements. They probably would have had to have they would have had to build the slab over the easements and pier, so put concrete piers in. So that would have cost more money as well. So you need to be just aware of those things before you're getting into a property. So you might think, oh, this house is only going to cost me 300 grand to build. The builder comes along and says, well, you got a stormwater pipe running right underneath the house, so I need to spend an extra 20 grand doing piers to get over that. So you just need to know that up front. And then the courtyard, that might have added an extra 10 or 20 grand to the build cost. So, all up, it might have cost an extra 50 grand for the build, which I don't know the value of this property, but if it's a more affordable house, that could be all your profit, or that could be a big chunk of the profit you were expecting to make.
Yeah. So luckily in this case, it's in a good area, so they could kind of that wasn't going to make or break
Yeah.
the deal. But you are right. So for example, on that right-hand lot, like you've obviously got the two pipes coming in, and when you start talking about piers, the width of the piers, they had to go across both pipes. So it's a fairly expensive slab.
In my view, in the grand scheme of things, depending on how deep that pipe is, that also makes a big difference. The deeper the pipe, the deeper the piles. But generally speaking, it's not that much more expensive to get over, like to put in a couple of piers. It costs you money, but it's normally not the end of the world. We'll put it that way, unless you're in a very low area, like low value area. Then, if you're only going to make 100 grand out of this project and that's an extra 50, that could be half your profit. But chances
Yeah.
are you
So
wouldn't be going into a deal like this where there might be $300,000 profit. So that might be, 300 minus 50,000. So you're only left with 250 profit, for example.
yeah. So luckily our client in this case was a house builder, so they kind of knew those risks about, and they knew what it meant when you had a pipe to build over. So these pipes here, I think, were 800 pipes, so they're really big ones.
Wow.
And you can, yeah. So like they knew that risk though, so they had mitigated it themselves because they knew what they were getting into. And for example, they weren't just selling the lots to the market; they were going to build the houses, so they had already accounted for that risk or that requirement in the FISO.
So there's two big solutions, and just to highlight this property, if this was on market, most people would run for the hills. They wouldn't think it would be able to be subdivided into two lots. And this is where you've got to start thinking outside the box, because we've all probably been on realestate.com and seen, oh, you can develop this property. And as soon as people see like something that's really obvious, then you normally can't make money on it because every man and their dog bids the price up, and that's normally how you don't make money. Whereas when you've got ones that are a bit out of the box like this is where you need a solution. So one is the town planner, and then the second part is the other consultants. You need your whole team to tell you what the solution is, and you also need to know how to drive the team to get a solution. So you need to tell your town planner, well, I need 2 lots out of this thing. And he might say to you, well, you got no hope. Or in this instance, he might say, well, we might have to do a drain. And then he's going to say, well, shoot, you got stormwater pipes. Have you allowed to build over these stormwater pipes? And then you need to get the details on that. So it's just being aware up front and not having surprises later on down the track, which a lot of people will get. And then that's how people end up not making any money from doing a development site.
Yeah, and yeah, and with these small ones, like if you get a big problem come up on these sites, the profit's then gone.
Yeah.
So you do have to be careful.
Yeah, you can't afford, for a lot of the smaller sites, you can't afford a $50,000 blowout. You need to know that up front. It's going to be 50 grand. So if it's 50, if that's what the number is, or 100, it means you need to factor that into the purchase price.
Correct. Like there's lots of little pitfalls, and that's our job and the job of the engineer to tell you what those are. Because there'll be people that pay overs for sites and then find this stuff out after the
every
fact.
other day. Every other day.
And we see it a lot in terms of people will come to us and then we'll say, like, a really good example is like where the sewer connection is. So if the sewer is not in the street and the manhole or the sewer line's in an adjacent property, like you do need the neighbour's consent if you want to put another connection in. Yeah. So that's a massive risk because you just don't have control of that connection. So all those little things there. Yes. Do you want me to go on to the next one?
Yeah, jump to the next one.
Sure. So this one here, once again, it's another 1 into 2. This site here was being sold just as a single house block. And in essence, most people were a little bit scared off due to the constraints on the site. So one of the first constraints which we had to overcome was bushfire hazard. So when you're subdividing a property, council have a certain requirement that the future house, simplistically, that the future house on there is going to be safe in the event that the adjacent vegetation gets on fire. So for example, this site here on the left-hand side of the property and on the top, so up the page on the northern side, was quite dense vegetation in the council park. So the first thing that we identified to the client was speak with a bushfire consultant to work out what the setback from the boundary to your future house is going to be, so you can work out whether you can actually do this subdivision. So when you're looking at this plan, you'll see this red line here, and that red line is at about 11.5 meters from the rear boundary. Mm-hmm. And what that's showing is that in this area here, you can't build a dwelling. You can only have a backyard, a swimming pool, a shed. So that's obviously really important to work out. So for example, Adam, if you can imagine, if that 11.5 meter hazard buffer also then was required on this boundary here on the left-hand side, you practically can't do a subdivision because you're just not going to have the area to build the future dwelling. So our bushfire consultant was, they went out to site, they inspected the vegetation, and they said, oh, look, I've been to site. You've actually got 2 different types of vegetation here. That triggers a certain kind of setback. And he also said, well, because of the way this vegetation, there's a buffer, there's a break between the vegetation, so the hazard on the left-hand side doesn't exist. So this is a good example where, once again, the client picked the site up and we're able to mitigate those risks. The other big ticket item for this one, and you can see there's 2 green lines, that reflects what's called core koala habitat, which is a state government mapping layer that you have to deal with. And also the local government, the planning scheme here is Brisbane, and you've got what's called the biodiversity overlay. Very simplistically, the intention of those policies from a state and local level is to avoid tree removal. So what our next step was after solving the bushfire problem was, what trees can we remove? What trees have to stay? And what we did was we engaged with an arborist to go out on site and actually tell us which trees were native and which trees were exotic or just domestic that we can remove. For example, with this one, there was 1 or 2 native trees which we actually sought to be removed to give a good building footprint. And we were able to obviously navigate that through with council in terms of which trees stayed and which trees had to go. It got a bit more complex as well in terms of, if you can imagine, we've got to provide a sewer connection for each block. And this one slopes to the rear as well. So it slopes from the street at the bottom to the top of the page. So we also had to do some drainage, and obviously we're designing that to avoid any additional tree removal. So there were the kind of big ticket items. And obviously, because this site had 70 hectares on it, a lot of people didn't want to look at it or didn't want to spend the money up front to kind of iron out these issues and pick it up.
Yeah. So that money up front would have been really the bushfire consultant and probably a bit of your time, which might have been, let's say, what, a few $1,000s maybe for this size site. So for a few $1,000s, you know, take the risk that it may not have worked. It's kind of like gambling a little bit in a way, but it's kind of, I more see it as an insurance policy. You're paying a $3,000 insurance policy to make sure you're not buying a dud site.
That's right. Yeah.
That you think doesn't have potential. And, you know, if this owner knew these principles, and same with agents to an extent, you know, if the owner and the agent knew all this stuff, they would have spent the few $1,000s and they might have got an extra $100,000 for the property, for example. So, you know, don't think just because you don't want to do the development doesn't mean that you shouldn't know about this stuff. But hey, if everyone knew about it, then there wouldn't be deals like this floating around. So it puts the people that do spend the time to learn about it and listen to videos like this, do my course, because this is only high level. There's a lot more detail in the course, but it's about spending the time getting the knowledge, which isn't overly extensive, that you can unlock an extra $100,000 just like that off one property, which that's a big amount of money for a lot of people. Like it might be 100 grand, it might be 500 grand. That's a big amount of money for really a very small amount of knowledge, because ultimately Liam's doing most of it. but you do still need to know the ultimate principles behind what it is, what outcome you're driving.
Correct. Like it's my job to assist the client to work through these issues. And for example, this is a good example where the seller of the property didn't bother or didn't want to or wasn't advised to say, oh, hang on, mate, maybe before you try and sell this property, maybe see if you can get an approval, go and speak to a town planner. And it works both ways. So there's some real estate agents that will call us because they want to understand or they want to check whether there's any potential for their seller, because they're trying to drive the highest price for the seller as well. So it cuts both ways.
Absolutely.
And
I've bought
that's our
plenty
job.
of properties where people thought they couldn't be subdivided, or they thought that they could only be subdivided into a couple of lots, and I've ended up getting a lot more than that. And I've bought them well, but it hasn't always been, with all due respect to town planners, it hasn't been driven by the town planner. It's been driven by me. So it's my ability to not only engage the town planner and the town planner then engage the other consultants, but it's about driving an outcome, like asking, well, how else can we do it? How do we deal with, and in this case, how do we deal with the bushfire? Can it just be one side? Does it need to be both? Is there another way we haven't looked at this? So just like questioning, trying to get a solution and pushing, well, I shouldn't say pushing, prodding, asking the questions of consultants. Well, why is it done that way? Why is there a setback to this rear boundary? And if you can understand the principles behind it, you don't have to do the calculations, but understand the principles, question those principles and the outcome, and you'll be pleasantly surprised what outcomes you end up getting a lot of the times.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, the skill of the developer is to drive the outcome. And obviously our job is to give advice. And that's the fun part of our job, like having the interaction with the client about,
Beating the client.
yeah, yeah, like it's trying to find an outcome outside the box. Have we thought of doing this differently?
Yeah.
Is there something else that we can involve? Can you
Yeah.
get a different consultant to work something out? So it's definitely like the developer drives the outcome. It's our job to be on that journey to achieve it and give advice around whether it is achievable, and obviously give advice on risk and how to mitigate and get an outcome. So
Yeah, so there's always a level of risk with these types of things. Probably the biggest risk on this one was probably the tree removal, like you said. So if
yep.
somebody's looking at this site, you just got to pick, or you just got to accept the worst case scenario, and whatever that worst case is, and be comfortable purchasing the property with that worst case scenario. And then obviously,
Yeah.
best case scenario, and hopefully you get the best case. But if you get the worst case, are you going to be okay? Are you going to lose money? Are you going to break even, or are you still going to make a little bit of money? Worst case. And for me,
Yeah.
worst case is still making a bit of money, because it still takes time and effort and energy to do all this stuff. If you're going to spend your energy on something, as much as we all love to do this stuff, we all need to eat and we got bills to pay. So you don't want to be working for free. So you want to be at least making some money as a worst case scenario.
Yeah. And with these smaller sites, like going from a 1 to 3, and that doesn't work, and you're stuck with a 1 to 2, that's a fairly significant, but that's a point where you may be losing money.
Yeah.
So yeah, like with the smaller projects where it's more knife edge, it's once again our town planner and other consultants, that's where the skill and the risk mitigation is with these small sites.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for your time, Liam. Really great to run through those couple of examples, which are fantastic. Hopefully it's opened up everyone to what's possible just in these smaller developments, and what challenges there are to overcome as well. What challenges there are for developers if you're not one, and also to highlight the importance of knowing about town planning and development, even if you're not planning to do any development, because it makes a big difference to the value of your property. So thanks so much again. Really appreciate it. If you've got any questions for Liam or any comments, I'm going to leave DTS their details if you want to get in contact with them. They are Brisbane based. They'll do planning all over Brisbane and a little bit in Sydney as well. So I can't highly recommend them more. So if you do want to get in touch with DTS, I'll leave the details below as well. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great one.
Thanks, Adam.